14th of November, 1952, 3:14 a.m., Harlem, New York. Bumpy Johnson sat in his armchair, wearing a silk robe, staring at the front door of his apartment on 138th Street. Outside that door, 15 heavily armed officers from the NYPD Vice squad were stacking up in the hallway. They carried sledgehammers, shotguns, and a warrant that didn't exist. Leading them was Lieutenant Patrick, the Butcher Clancy, a man who had put 30 men in the hospital that year alone. Through the thin wood, Clancy whispered to his sergeant, "When we get in there, break his jaw first, then look for the dope." It was an impossible situation. Bumpy was alone. He had 0 bodyguards present. He had nowhere to run. Everyone expected a massacre. They expected Bumpy to be dragged out in handcuffs, bleeding on the sidewalk. His reign over Harlem finished before sunrise. But what Clancy didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had been preparing for this exact 30-second window for 3 months. 45 minutes later, the police would flee that apartment with 3 broken noses, a shattered knee, and 0 evidence. Bumpy wouldn't have a scratch on him. This is the story of the Lubricated Raid. Think you could dismantle an armed SWAT team without throwing a single punch? To understand why this night was inevitable, you have to understand the ecosystem of 1950s Harlem. It wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a contested territory. On one side, you had the Italian families downtown. On the other, you had the NYPD, who operated less like law enforcement and more like a rival gang with badges. The Vice Squad didn't raid homes to stop crime. They raided homes to collect taxes. If you paid, you stayed open. If you refused, they broke your furniture and your bones until you got the message. Bumpy Johnson was the only thing standing between the community and total exploitation. He wasn't just a gangster. To the people of Harlem, he was the gatekeeper. But in 1952, the police commissioner decided the gatekeeper had to go. Lieutenant Clancy was the tool chosen for the job. Clancy was a brute who had served 10 years on the force and had accumulated 22 excessive force complaints, all dismissed. He was 240 pounds of state-sanctioned violence. He had publicly vowed to turn Bumpy Johnson into a memory. The police department gave Clancy an unlimited budget and a green light to use any means necessary. They believed Bumpy was just a thug who got lucky. They were about to learn he was a grandmaster playing against checkers players. The conflict started 8 weeks earlier, on September 10th. Lieutenant Clancy approached Bumpy outside the Lenox Lounge. It wasn't a friendly chat. Clancy demanded a 40% increase in the protection payments from the number racket spots. He leaned in close, tapping his nightstick on Bumpy's chest, and said, "Inflation hits everyone, Johnson. Pay up or we shut you down." Bumpy simply dusted off his lapel and replied, "I don't pay rent to guests in my own house." That was the trigger. Clancy took it personally. His ego couldn't handle a refusal from a black man in Harlem. The attacks began immediately. On September 15th, Clancy's men raided 3 of Bumpy's warehouses, smashing $12,000 worth of inventory. On September 22nd, they arrested 2 of Bumpy's top lieutenants on trumped-up vagrancy charges, holding them for 48 hours without food. On October 1st, Clancy personally pistol-whipped a runner named Shorty Davis just to send a message. Bumpy lost approximately $45,000 in 3 weeks. His organization was bleeding. To the streets, it looked like Bumpy was losing his grip. He seemed passive. He stayed in his apartment. He didn't retaliate. He didn't send soldiers to shoot at police cars. Instead, Bumpy was doing something that confused his own men. He hired a team of floor specialists and an electrician. While his men wanted war, Bumpy was obsessively logging the Vice Squad's shift patterns. He noticed that Clancy always hit targets between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. when the shift commanders changed over, leaving a gap in radio supervision. Bumpy wasn't retreating. He was curating the battlefield. He noted that Clancy liked to cut the power to the building before a raid to disorient the targets. Bumpy smiled when he realized this habit. It was the flaw he needed. By November, Clancy was bragging to the press that he had Bumpy on the ropes. He was confident. He was arrogant, and he was walking right into a meat grinder. On November 13th, Bumpy made the deliberate mistake Clancy was waiting for. He allowed a known snitch to overhear a conversation about a massive shipment of heroin being stored in his personal apartment for one night only. The bait was set. The snitch ran to Clancy within the hour. Clancy didn't verify the info. He didn't get a judge-signed warrant because he didn't want a paper trail for what he intended to be a robbery. He gathered 15 of his most brutal officers and headed for 138th Street. At 3:10 a.m., the convoy arrived. They moved silently up the stairs. Bumpy heard the heavy boots on the linoleum. He didn't reach for a gun. He picked up his coffee cup. Outside, Clancy signaled to cut the building's power. The hallway went black. Perfect. Clancy roared, "Police! Open up!" and didn't wait for an answer. 2 officers slammed a battering ram into the door. The lock, which Bumpy had intentionally weakened earlier that day, gave way instantly. The door swung open into pitch-black darkness. Clancy and 5 lead officers charged into the living room, screaming threats, expecting to tackle a sleeping man. Instead, their boots hit the floor that Bumpy had spent the last 2 days preparing. It wasn't just polished, it was coated in a thick, industrial-grade mechanics grease used for heavy machinery. The first officer's feet flew out from under him as if he were on ice. He slammed face first into the hardwood. The second officer, running full speed, tripped over the first man and crashed into a solid oak doorframe. The sound of crunching cartilage echoed in the dark. Clancy, moving with the momentum of a freight train, tried to stop, but the grease offered no traction. He slid uncontrollably across the room, arms flailing, until his face met the corner of a heavy marble coffee table. It was absolute chaos. Men were piling up, sliding, cursing, and colliding with furniture. Bumpy had strategically bolted to the floor. They were trapped in a dark, frictionless box. Bumpy sat in his armchair, which was placed on a dry rug in the corner, listening to the symphony of pain. The police thought they were just dealing with a slippery floor. They were wrong. The trap had a second phase. Bumpy had anticipated that once the initial chaos settled, the anger would take over and they would start shooting blindly. He needed witnesses. At 3:16 a.m., exactly 2 minutes after the door was kicked in, the lights didn't just come back on. A blinding wall of white light erupted from the kitchen and the hallway. Bumpy hadn't just hired floor guys. He had hired a photographer from the Amsterdam News and a freelance journalist, hiding them in the kitchen pantry and the bedroom closet. When Clancy tried to stand up, blood pouring from his nose, 4 high-intensity flashbulbs popped in rapid succession. The officers were blinded. They were disoriented, injured, and now... "Gentlemen," Bumpy said calmly, his voice cutting through the groans of the injured men, "you are currently trespassing. My lawyer, Mr. Shapiro, is standing in the kitchen with the photographer. You have no warrant, you have no probable cause, and you have just assaulted a private citizen." The brilliance of the plan wasn't the grease, it was the timing. Bumpy knew Clancy cut the power at the main box downstairs. Bumpy had wired his apartment to a separate, battery-operated emergency circuit that he controlled with a switch under his armchair. He controlled the light. He controlled the environment. The journalist stepped out, scribbling furiously. Clancy froze. He looked at his men, 3 with broken noses, 1 clutching a twisted knee, and himself, bleeding onto Bumpy's expensive rug. He realized the heroin shipment was a fabrication. There was nothing illegal in the room. Just 15 armed cops, a lawyer, a reporter, and a very calm gangster. Bumpy had weaponized the legal system against the enforcers of the law. He had the photos of them breaking in without a warrant. He had the photos of them weaponless and injured, looking incompetent. He had the testimony of a respected journalist. If Clancy arrested Bumpy now, the pictures would be on the front page of every paper in New York by morning. The headline wouldn't be, "Drug Lord Arrested." It would be, police brutality squad humiliated in botched raid. Clancy's face went pale beneath the blood. His hands shook. He looked at Bumpy, then at the camera, then back at Bumpy. He realized his career was hanging by a thread, and Bumpy was holding the scissors. The retreat was pathetic. Clancy had to order his men to crawl out of the apartment on their hands and knees because they couldn't stand up on the greased floor. They left a trail of blood and dignity all the way down the stairs. The consequences were immediate and severe. By 9 a.m., Bumpy's lawyer had filed a civil suit for property damage and harassment. He included the photographs. The police commissioner, terrified of a public relations nightmare during an election year, acted instantly. Lieutenant Clancy was suspended without pay the next day. 2 weeks later, he was quietly transferred to a desk job in the impound lot on Staten Island. He never patrolled Harlem again. The city of New York settled the lawsuit out of court for $3,500, enough to buy Bumpy 3 new cars in 1952. But the money didn't matter. The message did. News of the Lubricated Raid spread through the prisons and the precincts like wildfire. The other cops learned a valuable lesson. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal you could muscle. He was a fortress you couldn't breach. From that day forward, no officer dared to kick down Bumpy's door. If they needed to talk to him, they knocked. They asked politely. The power dynamic had completely inverted. Bumpy had used a bucket of grease and a camera to castrate the most violent squad in the NYPD. This story is the perfect example of why Bumpy Johnson is a legend. It wasn't about being the toughest guy in the room. It was about being the smartest. Bumpy understood that violence is a tool of the ignorant. Strategy is the weapon of the master. He proved that if you control the terrain, you control the outcome. He didn't fight the police force with force. He fought them with friction and physics. He used their own aggression against them, turning their momentum into their downfall. This is the principle of judo applied to street warfare. Most criminals would have engaged in a shootout and ended up dead or in Attica for life. Bumpy chose to humiliate his enemy instead. A dead enemy is a martyr. A humiliated enemy is a warning to everyone else. The lesson here is timeless. Preparation beats intimidation every single time. While his enemies were sharpening their knives, Bumpy was waxing the floor. Intelligence will always break brute force. The 14th of November 1952, Bumpy Johnson defeated 15 armed men with nothing but a slippery floor and a flashbulb. If this story of strategic genius showed you why brains beat brawn, smash that subscribe button. Drop a like if you believe preparation is the ultimate weapon. Comment below. Would you have panicked or planned? Remember, the most dangerous weapon in the room is the mind.